My name is Melissa Carter, and I remember the day everything broke with disturbing clarity. It was a Thursday morning, cloudy, bitter, like the taste of burnt coffee that lingered in the air of that small elementary school office. I was sitting in one of those rigid plastic chairs made more for control than comfort, facing the principal across a desk covered in reports and untouched paper cups. My son Ethan, 7 years old, was in his classroom, unaware that a man in a tie and a folder full of red marks was about to label his future. The walls were lined with bright posters saying things like "Never give up" and "Every child can learn." But I already knew none of those signs were meant for Ethan. They were too optimistic, too impersonal. The principal looked uncomfortable, shifting, avoiding my eyes, clearing his throat. I braced myself. I had been in enough meetings to recognize when a storm was about to break. "Mrs. Carter," he began, and then he just said it. Blunt, cold, without a hint of tact, "Your son is very dumb." I felt my spine go rigid. My breath stopped. For a second, the world shrank to that moment, that sentence. Time stilled. I stared at him, blinking, sure I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" He looked down, embarrassed now, maybe realizing the cruelty of his words too late. "I mean, he's significantly behind. In every subject. We're concerned. Deeply concerned." But that was not what he had said. What he said was that my child, my bright, curious, misunderstood little boy, was dumb. And nothing after that would erase it. I didn't speak. Not really. I nodded like I was made of stone, hands clutched tight in my lap. Rage burned under my skin, but louder than anger was the fear. The kind that creeps into your bones and tells you this is just the beginning. I had always known Ethan was different. He learned in ways that didn't fit the boxes this world liked to use. But this was the first time someone had turned his difference into a verdict. The meeting dragged on. Terms were thrown out like learning delays and resource assessments. I didn't hear most of them. My ears were still ringing with that one word. I wanted to scream, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They had already decided who my son was. They didn't want to understand him. They wanted to fix him, or worse, push him aside. When I finally left the office, my legs felt weak. The hallway outside was lined with children's art, glued paper and messy crayons, and somewhere among them was Ethan's. He had drawn a robot with too many arms and a smile too wide. He loved robots. Loved logic puzzles. Numbers. Patterns. Things no one in that meeting had even bothered to notice. I stood there for a moment, looking at his robot. And then I made a decision, not with words, but with something deeper. A vow. If the world couldn't see him for who he was, then I would show them. I would become the translator between my son and the world. I would never let a man in a tie decide his worth again. I walked back to the classroom and waited by the door. Ethan came out, his small backpack bouncing against his back, a crooked smile on his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, as if nothing in his world had shifted. But mine had. And I would never be the same. It took months. Months of unanswered questions, endless internet searches, waiting lists, and appointments that left me more confused than informed. Ethan's teachers had stopped trying by then. They sent notes home that all sounded the same: difficulty focusing, does not follow instructions, disruptive in group work. But none of them could tell me why. And I needed to know why. Not to excuse him, but to understand him. To finally have a name for the fog that hung over everything. I remember the day we received the diagnosis. A gray Tuesday in late March. The clinic was painted in soft, calming colors, as if they were trying to make bad news easier to digest. I sat in a chair across from a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard, holding Ethan's hand while he tapped his fingers in a perfect rhythm against his knees. He had no idea that today, someone would finally put a label on the thing that had made his young life so hard. I didn't know if that would be a blessing or a curse. "Mild autism spectrum disorder," she said, gently, like the words might shatter if spoken too loudly. Autism. I had read about it. I had suspected it. But hearing it out loud, seeing it written on paper, felt like the earth shifted slightly beneath me. I stared at the word on the report in her hands, and for a long second, I couldn't breathe. I felt a tidal wave rise inside me, a mix of fear, grief, relief, guilt, anger, all of it, crashing down at once. I know it's a lot, the doctor said. But this is also a beginning. Now you have a direction. Now you can understand how his brain works. What he needs. She was right. I nodded. I thanked her. I walked out with a thick folder and a child still humming to himself, unaware that his world had just been renamed. That night, I sat on my bed with the report open in my lap and cried harder than I ever had in my life. I cried because the word made things real. Because I knew the battles ahead wouldn't just be with teachers or systems, but with people who would never take the time to understand what the diagnosis really meant. People who would reduce Ethan to a category, a checklist, a statistic. People who would decide he was incapable without ever giving him a chance. But underneath the tears, buried deep, was a flicker of clarity. This wasn't the end of hope. It was a new path. And on this path, I couldn't afford to walk blindly anymore. I needed to learn everything I could. I needed to fight, not just as a mother, but as his interpreter in a world that spoke a different language than he did. I started printing articles, checking out books, watching seminars late into the night. I joined online groups, scrolled through forum threads, wrote to specialists who never replied. Every piece of information became a tool. Every insight, a brick in the armor I was building, for both of us. And slowly, I began to see Ethan differently. Not less. Not broken. Just different. He processed the world through logic, through repetition, through patterns. Where others saw chaos, he saw structure. When you memorized the sequence of a game after one try, I realized it wasn't luck, it was a different kind of intelligence. One the school had never bothered to recognize. But with every new understanding came a new fear. Because now I knew the truth, and I also knew how little the world cared for it. The next time the school called me in, I brought the diagnosis report with me. The principal skimmed it, barely reading past the first paragraph. Well, this explains a lot, he said, with a sigh that sounded more like resignation than interest. One of the teachers glanced at me and said, "We're not trained for this." That's when I understood, this paper wouldn't be the shield I'd hoped. If anything, it would be one more reason for them to give up on him. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. I walked out of that meeting and straight to the bookstore. I bought a dry erase board, markers, building blocks, toy robots, logic puzzles. I set up a space in our living room and decided that if the school wasn't going to teach Ethan in a way he could learn, then I would. I didn't have a degree in education. But I had something stronger. I had a reason. From that day forward, I made a promise, not just to fight for Ethan, but to understand him better than anyone else ever would. It happened on a Wednesday. I remember because I had just finished cleaning the kitchen when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, school number again. My stomach dropped. I picked up with a forced cheer in my voice, already preparing for the usual complaints. But this time, there was something different in the secretary's tone. Something urgent. "Mrs. Carter, we need you to come in. There's been an incident." By the time I reached Ethan's classroom, he was sitting on the floor, back pressed against the wall, his knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around them. He wasn't crying. He was completely still. Too still. His eyes locked on a point across the room like he couldn't, or wouldn't, look away. A teacher knelt beside him, saying his name over and over, as if repetition alone could bring him back. The classroom was silent except for the nervous rustle of children whispering and pretending not to stare. I rushed to him, crouched down, and whispered his name. His eyes shifted, slowly, toward mine. The recognition was there, but the light behind it had dimmed. Something had shut down. He froze, the teacher explained. We asked him to write his name on the board. He couldn't. He just stood there, and then, he dropped the marker and slid to the floor. I turned to look at the whiteboard. 4 letters. That was all they had asked of him. for letters that he knew, had written at home 100 times. But here, under the pressure, in front of watching eyes, it had become too much. I saw the giggles still fresh on some of the kids' faces, the half-suppressed smirks. One boy mimicked the way Ethan had dropped the marker. I felt heat rise in my chest, fury and shame swirling into something volatile. I didn't say anything. I simply gathered Ethan into my arms and carried him out. He didn't resist. His body was limp, compliant, quiet. Too quiet for a 7-year-old boy. In the car, he finally spoke. I couldn't move, Mommy. My brain got stuck. I pulled over and cried. Right there on the side of the road. Not in front of him, beside him. He watched me, head tilted, unsure why tears had finally come. At home, I asked for a meeting with the school. Again. This time, the tone had changed. There was less concern, more impatience. He's not adjusting, one of the staff said. He's falling behind. He's slowing the pace for the rest of the class. Slowing the pace. As if education was a race and he was the weight dragging the others back. I listened quietly, but inside, something hardened. A mother's tolerance has a limit. And I had just found mine. I stood up and said the only thing that felt true: you may not be able to teach my son the way he needs. But I can promise you this: he will never be in a room again where people think he's the problem. That night, I stayed awake researching meltdown triggers. Not tantrums, meltdowns. There's a difference. One is about control. The other is about collapse. Ethan's had been the latter. It wasn't defiance, it was overwhelm. A sensory, emotional overload so intense it had paralyzed him. I bought noise-canceling headphones, sensory toys, timers, visual schedules. I restructured our routines. I taught him breathing techniques and created safe words for when he felt the build-up coming. And more than anything, I promised he'd never be alone in it again. But what haunted me most wasn't the meltdown. It was the way they had talked about him. Not as a student. Not even as a child. But as an obstacle. A disruption. I realized something that week: the world would never slow down for Ethan. So I would have to teach him how to build his own pace. And to trust that it was valid. That it mattered. We started doing name drills at home, not to force him, but to let him reclaim the space that had humiliated him. Sometimes, he wrote it backwards. Sometimes, he stared at the paper for 10 minutes before touching the pen. But each time, he finished. And each time, I cheered. After one of our sessions, he looked up at me and said, "I like learning with you. It doesn't feel like I'm failing." That's when I knew the school was wrong. Not just about him, but about everything. The way they measured success. The way they dismissed potential. The way they only saw value in speed, obedience, conformity. Ethan wasn't slow. He wasn't behind. He was different. And from that point on, I stopped trying to make him fit their mold. I began crafting a new one. The decision didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces, in the slow ache of exhaustion, in the mounting frustration of homework that ended in tears, in the emptiness I felt every time I walked past Ethan's school knowing he wasn't really learning, just enduring. I was working part-time then, managing schedules, bills, and survival. But after that first collapse, something shifted in me. I couldn't go back to life as usual. My job gave us income. But my son needed me full-time. So I quit. Friends called it impulsive. Family called it reckless. But I knew the truth: I was making a trade. Stability for presence. Predictability for possibility. If the school couldn't teach him the way he learned, then I would. Somehow. The first day at home, I sat Ethan at the kitchen table, a whiteboard between us, and said, "We're going to try something different." He looked at me cautiously. "No pressure," I added. "No grades. Just us." He nodded, tapping his fingers on the table in a rhythm I had come to recognize, his way of preparing to focus. I started with what the school said he failed at: letters, numbers, basic math. But instead of worksheets and drills, I turned the problems into games. We used magnets, puzzle pieces, building blocks. I made flashcards shaped like spaceships, wrote numbers on the backs of toy robots. When we practiced spelling, I let him build the words with magnetic tiles on the fridge while narrating them in a silly robot voice he liked. It wasn't perfect. Some days were slow, others ended with both of us frustrated. But over time, I noticed something no one at school had ever seen: Ethan remembered patterns faster than I could create them. Once, I gave him a number sequence by accident while I was distracted, and he solved the next 5 steps in his head without blinking. When I asked him how he did it, he said, "It made sense. Like code." That was the moment it clicked. I leaned into it. I found old electronics in the garage and let him take them apart. He loved it, touching wires, examining circuits, guessing what each part did. I bought a beginner's robotics kit online. It was expensive, more than we could afford, but I used the last of my savings and called it an investment. When it arrived, Ethan stayed up for 3 hours building a tiny robot that could follow a line on the floor. When it worked, he looked at me with such pride it made my chest hurt. "It listened to me," he said. "Like it understood." That robot became our first breakthrough. I built our curriculum around it. Science, math, even reading, everything funneled through logic and technology. I made worksheets in the form of missions. Our house turned into a lab. The dining room became the engineering wing. And Ethan started waking up excited to learn. He still struggled with writing. Still froze when asked to explain himself aloud. But his confidence grew. He began to smile more, laugh freely. The lines under his eyes, ones that no 7-year-old should carry, began to fade. One day, during one of our lessons, he turned to me and asked, "Was I born wrong?" I felt like I'd been punched. I had to take a breath before I answered. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You were born wired differently. And that's not wrong. That's rare. And rare things are hard for some people to understand." He nodded, like he wanted to believe it but wasn't quite there yet. So I kept proving it. Every day. We started documenting our progress: videos, photos, journals. Not for school. For us. Proof. That he was learning. That I wasn't crazy. That he wasn't broken. I reached out to specialists, tutors, parents. Some responded. Some dismissed me. But one therapist saw our videos and said, "He's not behind. He's just bilingual, he speaks in logic, and we're teaching in emotion." I wrote that on a post-it and stuck it to the wall. That year, we didn't celebrate birthdays with parties or vacations. We celebrated with breakthroughs. The day Ethan programmed his first light sequence, we had cake. When he read his first paragraph aloud without stuttering, we went for ice cream. When he asked to read a manual, an actual instruction manual, I cried quietly in the hallway. I wasn't a trained teacher. I wasn't equipped, funded, or certified. But I was consistent. And for Ethan, that made all the difference. The world outside didn't understand. Neighbors whispered. Some said I was sheltering him too much, that he'd never learn to survive out there. But I'd seen what out there had done to him. How it erased his voice before he even had a chance to use it. No. I wasn't sheltering him. I was rebuilding him. And in doing so, I was rebuilding myself. The letter arrived folded in thirds, no envelope, tucked inside Ethan's school folder like it was just another permission slip. It was a standard printed notice, signed at the bottom with a name I didn't recognize. No greeting. No context. Just a decision: we are transferring Ethan Carter to the Specialized Educational Support Unit beginning next term. It was phrased with careful detachment, like they were moving furniture, not a child. I read it twice. Then a third time. My eyes didn't mislead me. The words were clear, cold, and final. I stared at it in silence, the page trembling slightly in my hands. Ethan was at the table, legs swinging, scribbling diagrams of his latest robot design. I didn't show him the paper. I couldn't. Not yet. The next day, I walked back into the school. Not as the mother they thought they knew, the tired, polite one who nodded through their decisions. I walked in as something else entirely. I was done asking. Now I was demanding. The meeting they arranged was in a smaller room than before. No principal this time, just an administrative supervisor and 2 teachers who avoided my eyes. They used words like inclusion fatigue and peer performance standards. They said Ethan's progress at home was noted but not replicable in a classroom environment. One of them even smiled, softly, like she was doing me a favor. We believe he'll thrive better with specialized attention, she said. You believe, I replied, folding the paper neatly. But you didn't ask. You didn't observe. You didn't even consult me. This is a decision you made in isolation, based on convenience, not capacity. There was a pause. One of the women shifted in her chair. It's not about convenience, the administrator said. It's about what's best for the group. That was it. The truth, finally said out loud. Not what was best for Ethan. What was best for the group. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I looked them in the eye and said, my son is not your burden to offload. And if you think this is over, you're mistaken. You don't get to give up on him because he learns differently. Not while I'm his mother. And just like that, the war went public. I called the school board. I filed an appeal. I contacted every advocacy group I could find online. I started learning legal terms I'd never wanted to know. IDEA. FAPE. Section 504. I stayed up reading case law while Ethan slept in the next room. People around us noticed. Some offered quiet encouragement. Others weren't so kind. At the grocery store, a neighbor muttered that I was making it harder for everyone. In the church parking lot, a parent I barely knew told me I was too intense and maybe Ethan did need a different kind of school. They all said the same thing in different ways. Why are you fighting this hard? Because they had no idea what giving up looked like. I'd seen it, in the eyes of kids already pushed into corners, into systems that managed rather than nurtured. I wasn't going to let Ethan become someone's paperwork. I wasn't going to let them exile him with a smile. Weeks passed. The school stalled. The legal gears turned slowly. During that time, I kept teaching. Our house became more than a classroom. It became a fortress. A lab. A haven. Ethan was thriving, assembling more complex logic puzzles, narrating his problem-solving steps like a miniature professor. I recorded everything. Documented every milestone. Every robot he built, every sentence he read, every challenge he overcame. I sent the videos to the school board. And then something unexpected happened. An advocate from the district, someone I hadn't contacted directly, called me. She had watched the footage. She had read my letters. She asked if we could meet. In her office, she looked me in the eye and said, "You're not wrong. He has a right to stay in a regular classroom. But you need to be ready. They won't make it easy." I was ready. A month later, the transfer was reversed. Quietly. No apology. No explanation. Just a follow-up email, Ethan will remain in his current placement. We celebrated that night. Not with balloons or banners. Just pizza and Ethan's favorite movie. He didn't fully understand what had happened. But he knew I had fought. He looked at me and said, "They tried to move me. You didn't let them." "No," I said, pulling him close. "I never will." It wasn't the end of the battle. But it was our first victory. And I had no intention of stopping there. By the time Ethan reached high school, the air around him had shifted. He was taller, more withdrawn, and had developed a kind of quiet precision in the way he moved, like he was always measuring the space between himself and the rest of the world. The bullying had faded into avoidance. Teachers had stopped trying to fix him and started managing him, like a schedule conflict they had to keep rescheduling. Then came Mr. Rudd. He was a technology teacher, mid-50s, sleeves always rolled, voice like sandpaper, and the rare quality of not talking to students like they were beneath him. When I met him, he looked me in the eye and said, "I've seen how his mind works. I think we can build something." It was the first time in years that a teacher didn't speak of Ethan like he was a problem to be handled. Mr. Rudd invited Ethan to participate in the school's annual science fair. I hesitated. Flashbacks of the classroom collapse still haunted me. The idea of him being judged, again, publicly, made my stomach churn. But when I asked Ethan if he wanted to do it, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Can it be a robot?" It began with graph paper. Sketches. Ideas scribbled in the margins of old notebooks. He wanted to build a robot that could solve mazes. Not just any maze, but one it had never seen before. "It's like me," he said. "It learns by trying." We ordered supplies. Wires, motors, a tiny processor, infrared sensors. Every dollar felt like a risk, but I took it gladly. I watched him work for hours, no guidance, no instructions. Just logic, patience, and this fierce, quiet joy I hadn't seen since he was little. The night before the fair, the robot failed. It stalled halfway through a test maze and spun in circles until it powered down. Ethan stared at it, expressionless. I waited for the frustration, the collapse, the shutdown. But it didn't come. "I need to change the algorithm," he said. He stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning rewriting code. I hovered nearby, useless but present. By sunrise, the robot made it through the maze in under 30 seconds. He didn't smile. He nodded, satisfied. The day of the fair, I walked with him into the gymnasium, heart pounding. The room buzzed with students, parents, judges. Most booths had poster boards, glitter, and lots of words. Ethan had a table, a laptop, and a small robot with blinking lights. When the judges arrived, he didn't greet them. He launched straight into explanation, his voice flat but steady, describing how the robot used conditional loops and distance sensors to recalibrate paths in real time. One of the judges interrupted. "But how is this educational? It's just a toy." Ethan looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. "It's not a toy. It's how I learn." Silence. He ran the demo. The robot raced through the maze, made 3 corrections, and reached the end in 24 seconds. Another student whispered, "Wait, it beat mine." The judges scribbled notes. No praise. No smiles. Just furrowed brows and quiet glances exchanged between them. I recognized the look, they didn't know what to do with him. That night, the winners were announced. First, second, and third place went to projects with bright posters and catchy titles. Ethan's name wasn't called. He didn't ask why. He didn't react at all. But as we walked to the car, I noticed something strange. The judges? They watched him leave. Like they were seeing something they hadn't known how to recognize. At home, I told him I was proud. Not for the project, but for how he stood there, explained it, ran it, owned it. He shrugged. It worked. That's what matters. I posted a video of the presentation on a parenting forum, captioned with a single sentence, "They didn't clap, but they watched him leave." The next morning, my inbox was full. Teachers. Parents. Even 2 tech bloggers. They asked who built the robot. How? Why? What was next? What was next? I didn't know. But something had shifted. Not in Ethan. In how the world began to look at him. We had done everything right. Submitted applications to 3 local universities, places with engineering programs, tech labs, and words like inclusive splashed across their websites. I helped Ethan write his essays, careful not to over-edit. His voice was quiet but exact, like always. He described how he thought in patterns, how every failure helped him refine a system, and how building a robot that could solve mazes was his way of proving he could navigate the world, even when it didn't make sense to him. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He just told the truth. I don't learn like most people, he wrote in the final line of every essay, but I build things that work. Then we waited. For weeks, Ethan didn't say much about it. He went on coding, adjusting designs, testing new builds. He didn't ask when the responses would come. Maybe because he already suspected what was coming. I, on the other hand, still believed the world had space for him. For logic over eloquence. For potential over polish. I believed, because I had to. The first letter came by mail, thin and impersonal. I knew before I opened it. After careful consideration, it began, and the rest might as well have been static. I stood in the kitchen staring at the words, unable to swallow the familiar bitterness rising in my throat. Ethan came in, saw the envelope, and raised one eyebrow. "First one?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't even blink. "Okay," he said, and went back to the living room. The second came through email 2 days later. I was sitting on the couch beside him when the notification popped up. The message was shorter this time, more modern, less stressed and polite regret. It pointed to concerns regarding social fit and difficulty demonstrating collaborative aptitude during evaluation. I read those phrases 3 times, trying to decode the cruelty hiding behind academic detachment. They hadn't accepted him because of how he came across. Not because of his skills. Not because of grades. Because he didn't talk like they expected. Didn't perform their version of engagement. He didn't charm them. He didn't sparkle. Ethan read over my shoulder. "They didn't like my silence," he said simply. "You didn't get a real chance," I replied. He shrugged, but there was a twitch in his fingers, a sign I knew too well. He wasn't unaffected. He was internalizing. Rewriting. Adapting silently like he always did. The third rejection was the worst. It arrived with feedback attached, actual notes scribbled by panelists during his interview. One comment said, "Lacks charisma." Another, "Minimal eye contact." Seemed uncomfortable. The final line hit me like a punch, "Candidate may not be a good fit for campus culture." That was it. Not his intelligence. Not his potential. Just his inability to mirror their expectations. I closed the document and stared at the wall. I felt rage. A deep, maternal fury laced with helplessness. Not because they had rejected him. But because they had never really seen him. That evening, I found him in his room, typing something. Not a game. Not code. Just a document. A single window open, blank page filling slowly with his thoughts. "Another letter?" I asked gently. He didn't look up. "No. I'm done applying. They don't want me." "That's fine." I sat on the edge of the bed. "But it's not fair." "You deserve, it's not about deserve," he said, still typing. "It's about fit. And maybe I don't fit. Maybe I'm not supposed to." He finished typing, paused, then opened the camera on his laptop. I watched as he hit record. "My name is Ethan Carter," he began. "And I think in code." He spoke for almost 6 minutes. Calm, measured, staring somewhere just past the lens. He explained how traditional interviews confused him. How scripted smiles and shallow small talk felt more alien than math ever did. How he wasn't broken, he was built differently. And how the rejection letters only confirmed something he'd long suspected: the systems meant to measure talent were designed for predictability, not innovation. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't beg for attention. He just explained himself like a set of instructions. Then he clicked stop, uploaded it to a video platform, and titled it, "How My Brain Works." He didn't check it again that night. Just return to his code. I watched it 3 times before bed. Then I shared it. Just a few groups. Parents of neurodivergent kids. Forums where I knew people would understand. No hashtags. No expectations. I went to sleep angry. I didn't know the world was about to answer. It started slow. A handful of views. A couple of comments from strangers saying things like, "This reminds me of my son," or "Wish I had known this growing up." At first, I thought that would be the end of it, Few people touched, a quiet ripple in a sea of louder voices. Ethan didn't ask about it, didn't check the numbers, didn't care. For him, it had never been about who listened. It was about finally saying it. By the second day, the view count had crossed 10,000. A tech blogger embedded it in an article titled "The Silent Genius Next Door." That night, a neuroscience professor from a well-known university shared it with a single line, "This young man explains neurodivergence better than most textbooks." Then it exploded. By the end of the week, over 300,000 people had watched the video. Ethan's face was everywhere, on parenting forums, science pages, educational networks. It wasn't the flash or production value. It was the calm way he spoke. The logic behind every sentence. The vulnerability woven into a voice that never wavered. People weren't just watching, they were responding. Comments flooded in from across the globe. Parents who had felt lost for years. Teenagers who saw themselves in Ethan's story. Teachers asking how they could do better. Coders, engineers, psychologists. All of them stunned not just by what Ethan had built, but by how he thought. Someone created subtitles in 5 languages. A well-known autism advocate referenced the video in a TED Talk. And then, the message came. It was a plain email. No bolded logos. No dramatic subject line. Just, from admissions@harvard.edu subject, interview request, Ethan Carter. I stared at it for a full minute, convinced it was a prank. I read it again, then again, each time slower, until I realized it was real. A professor from the School of Engineering had seen the video, forwarded it to the admissions board, and now they wanted to meet him. Not review him. Not assess him. Meet him. I walked to Ethan's room, heart pounding, hands trembling with the printed message. "You've got an interview," I said. He didn't look up from his keyboard. "Where?" "Harvard." He paused, his fingers stilling mid-code. "That's in Boston." "Yes." Silence stretched for a beat. "Okay," he said, like I just told him it might rain tomorrow. "That's it?" I laughed. "Okay." He looked at me, calm. "It doesn't change anything. I'm still me." I nodded, tears gathering but not yet falling. "Exactly." We spent the next week preparing. Or rather, I prepared. I read interview tips, scouted forums, printed mock questions. Ethan refused to rehearse. If they want to know me, they can ask me. I don't want to memorize answers to someone else's script. I gave up trying to coach him. Deep down, I was terrified. Not of failure, but of them seeing him, really seeing him, and deciding, like so many others, that he wasn't enough. That he was interesting, but not acceptable. Brilliant, but not a fit. But we flew to Boston anyway. The campus was cold and timeless. Red brick, echoing halls, students buzzing with a kind of confident energy Ethan didn't share. He looked out of place. Not uncomfortable, just separate. Like he was observing from a parallel layer. The interview took place in a small conference room. 1 professor, 2 faculty members, a student representative. Ethan sat across from them, still as ever, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap. They started with pleasantries. He blinked. Then they asked about the robot. He unfolded, slowly, methodically. He explained his process. How he didn't just build to function, but to simulate logic under pressure. How he programmed the machine to reflect the same steps he used when overwhelmed: pause, scan, decide. They asked why. Because I wanted to understand myself, he said. And because the world tries to fix things before it understands them. The room fell quiet. I watched from the doorway, barely breathing. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When we left, Ethan turned to me in the hallway and said, "That wasn't bad." They listened. He was right. 3 weeks later, the letter came. An official envelope, thick, embossed. I held it in shaking hands, waited for Ethan to come home, then placed it on the table between us. He opened it like it was junk mail. Pulled out the paper. Read silently. Then he looked at me and said, "Full scholarship. Engineering." I didn't speak. I couldn't. He smiled, just a little, and added, "So I guess I'm moving to Boston." That night, I finally let the tears fall. Not because I was afraid. But because, for the first time in years, I wasn't. The morning we left for Boston, the house felt quieter than usual. Ethan double-checked his packing list with mechanical efficiency, chargers, adapters, spare components for his newest design, noise-canceling headphones, and 3 sets of the same kind of hoodie he'd worn for years. I watched him from the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, trying to memorize every detail of that moment. He didn't seem nervous. Not exactly. But there was a weight in the way he moved, as if his thoughts were louder than the sounds around him. We flew in silence, shoulder to shoulder on a crowded plane. He stared out the window the entire flight, eyes fixed on the clouds, hands folded neatly in his lap. I didn't ask what he was thinking. I never needed to. Landing in Boston felt like arriving on another planet. The city was colder, faster, layered in history and ambition. Harvard's campus felt like it had been carved from time, old stone buildings, endless green lawns, students with polished strides and practiced confidence. I could see it in their eyes, most of them had been raised for this. Groomed. Prepared. Ethan just observed. He didn't marvel. He didn't flinch. He walked those grounds like he was studying a new system, cataloging it, not questioning it. Orientation week was a blur of names, forms, access cards, tours, briefings. I stayed in the background, watching him navigate it all. He didn't try to make friends. He didn't engage in the nervous small talk around him. But he didn't retreat either. He absorbed. Like data. Like code. His dorm was small but efficient. 1 desk, 1 bed, 1 shelf. He set up his equipment in the first hour, laptop, modular kits, his latest prototype. Within minutes, it looked like home. Or rather, it looked like his world, one he had carried with him, unchanged, through airports and time zones and expectations. Before I left, I stood in the doorway, hesitating. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "I'll learn the system." "Do you want me to?" "No." "You should go." I smiled. It hurt. But I smiled. "Text me if you need anything." "I know." He didn't hug me. I didn't expect him to. But as I turned to leave, he said quietly, "Thanks, Mom." 2 words. 2 words that carried every sleepless night, every fight with the school, every robot on our dining table, every line of misunderstood code. I left the building, found a quiet bench near the courtyard, and cried. Not out of fear. Not out of grief. But because he had made it. Classes began. He took to them like they were puzzles to solve. Professors noticed. Some tried to connect. Others didn't know how. But Ethan thrived not through charisma or collaboration, but through precision. He submitted projects that bent assignments into something new. When asked to build a simple logic circuit, he turned in a system that mimicked emotional choice trees. He didn't volunteer in class. But he answered when called. And when he spoke, people listened. Slowly, word spread. There was the computer science professor who invited him to a graduate-level seminar after seeing his code. There was the student group that built accessibility tech and asked for his input. There was the assistant dean who emailed me, saying, "Your son sees things we don't." Ethan never mentioned these things unless I asked. He just kept building. In his second year, he published a paper. By the third, he had a paid position in a lab researching AI behavior modeling based on neurodiverse input systems. The irony wasn't lost on me. My son, once deemed unteachable, was now informing how machines might better understand human difference. He came home during breaks. Still quiet. Still precise. But something had changed. One night, over tea, I asked him, "Do you feel like you belong there?" He thought for a long time. "I feel like I was built for something. And now I'm close to finding out what." That was his way of saying yes. For years passed like chapters in a book I hadn't dared dream of. I watched him cross each milestone with the same steady rhythm he had as a child, unmoved by noise, focused on function. He never became the loudest in the room. But he became the one they turned to when things stopped working. In his final year, he led a capstone team. The only time he told me about it was when he said, "I made sure everyone had a role. Like code, if a function doesn't run, you don't delete it. You fix the connection." He had fixed his own connections. Rewired how the world engaged with him, not by changing who he was, but by refusing to let them misread his signal. When graduation approached, I got the email from the university, "Ethan Carter has been selected as this year's engineering commencement speaker." I read it twice. Then again. And then I sat down on the kitchen floor and wept. The auditorium was full, rows and rows of families, friends, students dressed in caps and gowns, a sea of crimson and black. I arrived early, found my seat in the middle rows, and held the program in my hands like it was made of glass. Commencement ceremony, School of Engineering. I scanned the list of names, stopping when I saw his Ethan Carter, class speaker. I read it over and over, mouthing the words but not fully believing them. Around me, parents chatted nervously, snapped photos, fixed robes. The energy was electric. But I sat in stillness, the kind that only comes after years of noise of meetings, papers, diagnoses, fights, doubts. Today was a silence earned, not gifted. The lights dimmed. The processional music began. And there he was. Walking in line, gown too big on his narrow frame, cap slightly crooked, expression unreadable. He looked like every other student. And at the same time, he didn't. Because I knew the path that had brought him there. Every inch of it. He found his seat among the graduates, folded his hands, waited. Speeches began, deans, chairs, honors lists. I barely heard them. My eyes were fixed on one place. I held my breath when they called his name. And now, the class of engineering is proud to welcome their selected speaker, Ethan Carter. There was polite applause. A few claps louder than others. But mostly, curiosity. He rose. Walked slowly to the podium. Stood in front of the microphone, adjusting it with precise care. No notes. No phone. Just him. He looked out at the crowd, not directly into anyone's eyes, but somewhere just above our heads. The way he always did when he needed to speak without pressure. And then, in a voice clear and steady, he began. "When I was 7 years old," he said, "someone told my mother I was too dumb to succeed." A hush fell across the room. They didn't whisper it. They said it in a meeting. With reports and charts and a tired kind of certainty. I couldn't spell my name fast enough. I couldn't sit still the right way. I didn't raise my hand at the right time. So they assumed I couldn't think. He paused. Let it settle. They didn't understand that my mind wasn't broken. It was just wired differently. While they taught with words, I listened in systems. While they graded speed, I learned by iteration. While they looked for answers, I built models. There was no emotion in his voice. Only truth. They tried to fix me. But what I needed wasn't repair. It was translation. He glanced down for a breath, then back up. And my translator was my mother. A wave moved through the crowd. You could feel it. She never asked me to be normal. She just asked me to be honest. She didn't teach me how to fit in. She showed me how to stand out with integrity. I gripped the edge of the seat. My throat burned. There were years of silence. Years of rejection. But what no one expected, he said, was that a child who couldn't make eye contact would someday be asked to speak on a stage like this. A chuckle ran through the audience. Not mockery. Recognition. Engineering is the art of solving problems. And sometimes, the hardest problem to solve is how we define who belongs. He took a breath. So if you remember anything from this moment, let it be this: intelligence doesn't always look like you expect. Brilliance doesn't always speak your language. And just because someone learns differently doesn't mean they learn less. He stepped back. No dramatic ending. No flourish. Just the truth, left ringing in the air like a clean bell tone. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, first one, then three, then the entire room stood. A standing ovation. The sound rose like thunder. I stood with them, tears streaming down my face, no longer silent. I didn't care who saw. Across the room, Ethan spotted me. Our eyes didn't lock. He looked just to the left, close enough. Close enough for everything to pass between us. He gave a small nod. And I knew. He had not just arrived. He had changed the room. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into the quad like waves breaking against stone. There were hugs, handshakes, photos, confetti cannons and laughter echoing between the buildings. But I didn't move. I stood at the edge of it all, watching Ethan from a distance. He had slipped away from the center of the attention as soon as the applause faded, just like I knew he would. While the other graduates gathered in clusters, he stood under the shade of a large oak, arms crossed, calm as ever. I walked to him slowly, still unsure if I'd dreamed the last hour. "You were incredible," I said. He looked at me, not quite into my eyes, but just close enough, and replied, "It wasn't for them." "No? No. It was for you." I blinked. "In that room," he continued, "they saw a speech. But I was writing code. And you were the input." My breath caught in my chest. He pulled something from the pocket of his gown, a folded piece of paper. I recognized the edges, the creases. The original science fair program from years ago, faded, worn. On the back of it, he had written something in pen. He handed it to me without ceremony. I read the words carefully, his handwriting still uneven but confident. My mother never saw me as a problem. She was the code that translated my silence. She wrote the language the world couldn't read. I wanted to speak, but no words came. My throat closed, heart full to bursting. So I just held the paper to my chest and nodded. Behind us, the university president was shaking hands with a line of faculty. Among them, I spotted her, older now, her hair more gray than blonde, but unmistakable. The elementary school principal. She stood near the back of the crowd, arms folded tightly across her chest, a strained smile stretched across her lips. I don't know if she had seen Ethan speak, or if she had been told afterward who he was. But she saw me. Our eyes met for a single, long second. And she looked away. Not in shame. In surrender. It was enough. Later that afternoon, Ethan and I returned to his apartment just off campus. It was sparse, methodical, every object in its place, every surface clean. He made tea, just like I used to make it for him when he was a child. Mint and honey. We sat on opposite sides of a narrow table, the silence between us no longer heavy but shared. Comfortable. "I want to start something," he said suddenly. "Like a company?" "No. Like a program. For kids like me. But earlier. Before the system teaches them to be ashamed." I nodded. "What would it be?" "A place where logic is the first language. Where they can build instead of explain. Where they're not asked to prove they belong. They just do." He looked up. "I want to teach them the way you taught me. My hand covered my mouth, not to hide tears this time, but to hold in a cry that wanted to break free. "Whatever you need," I said. He smiled, that rare and honest smile that only came when he felt completely understood. "There's one more thing," he added, reaching into a drawer. He pulled out an old composition notebook, black and white, corners frayed, pages yellowed. I recognized it immediately. My notebook. The one I used in those early days of teaching him at home. I thought I'd lost it. He slid it across the table. "Page 63, he said. I opened it with trembling fingers. On that page, written in my own tired handwriting from nearly a decade earlier, were these words: "They say he's dumb. One day, they'll stand and applaud. I just have to keep building the bridge between him and the world." I had forgotten I wrote it. But he hadn't. "I read it the night before the Harvard interview," he said. I ran my hand across the ink, faded but still there, like everything that had held us together. "You built the bridge," he whispered. "Now I'll build the doors." Outside, the city buzzed with possibility. Inside, my son, once dismissed, once labeled, once underestimated, was drawing new blueprints for other children no one had ever thought to believe in. And this time, they wouldn't have to wait to be understood. They would begin in their own language. Today, I sit by the window of my small home office, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and watch the emails come in. Every morning, without fail, they arrive, messages from parents I've never met, strangers from across the world. They all begin the same way: "I saw your son's video. I read the article about Ethan. My daughter is like him. We thought we were alone." Some are short. Others unfold into stories, diagnoses, heartbreaks, school meetings that ended in silence. And always, the same aching plea: "How did you do it?" I try to answer each one. Not with magic or advice, but with truth. I didn't fix him. I stopped trying to make him fit. Because that's the part most people miss. This was never about forcing Ethan into the world's mold. It was about protecting the integrity of how he was made. Since graduating, Ethan has kept his word. He launched his program 6 months after leaving Harvard. It's called Pattern School, a learning initiative designed specifically for neurodivergent children who think in logic, not linearity. The tagline is simple: we don't teach the way the world expects. We teach the way minds are built. He runs workshops in public libraries. Builds online modules. Hosts live coding sessions where silence is respected, pauses are encouraged, and no one is forced to speak before they're ready. Children come from all over, some who've never answered a question in class, others who've been suspended for noncompliance. In Ethan's space, they find order. Possibility. Identity. The first boy who completed his maze navigation module wrote, "I thought I was dumb until I learned I was just thinking faster than I could explain." That letter hangs framed in Ethan's office. And now, other institutions have taken notice. Universities. Non-profits. Private schools desperate to understand what traditional systems have failed to grasp. They invite Ethan to speak. Consult. Redesign. He rarely accepts. Not because he's above it, but because he knows exactly where his energy is needed. With the kids. Always the kids. He moved into a quiet loft not far from where he teaches. Still lives alone. Still keeps things in perfect order. Still eats the same breakfast every morning: toast, honey, mint tea. I visit often. Sometimes he talks. Sometimes we just sit, typing in parallel, 2 screens glowing in the same rhythm. Last winter, we attended a conference together. He was asked to present on logic-based learning for atypical cognition. I watched him stand in front of a room full of educators, policymakers, doctors, people who, not long ago, might have called him broken. He began, not with code or research, but with a story. A long time ago, a teacher said I wouldn't finish school. That I slowed everyone down. But my mother didn't slow down. She rewrote the rules until I could move at my own speed. The room was silent. She didn't teach me to succeed. She taught me to understand how I succeed. There's a difference. Afterward, people lined up to speak to him. Ask questions. Shake his hand. He nodded politely. Answered concisely. And when we left, he turned to me and said, "I still don't like crowds. But I like proving them wrong." At home, I keep one last notebook. It's not for lesson plans or diagnosis notes. It's a journal. A place where I write down the milestones, the quiet kind. The things no one claps for but that mean everything. Like the time Ethan held a child's hand during a session because the boy was having a sensory overload and needed pressure. Like the night he called just to ask what time I used to make him stop studying for dinner. Like the email I received from that same elementary school principal, the one who once said he was very dumb. Her message was short. Just this: I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because I had already written the answer. It's on the last page of the journal, penned last week. They said he was dumb. Today, they rise when he walks in. And every time I write in that notebook, I remember that boy, the one who couldn't say his name out loud, who built mazes on our dining table, who once asked if he was born wrong. And I remember answering him. No. You were born wired like lightning. And now the world is learning how to catch up.